Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I was never one of those people who worried about being called paranoid. Honestly, I never even minded the whispers behind my back or the raised eyebrows when neighbors caught glimpses of my reinforced storm shutters. My ex-wife, Stephanie, used to say I was obsessed. She wasn't exactly wrong, but the way I saw it, there was a fine line between obsession and preparation, and I'd rather cross it early than too late. My name is Kyle Grayson. I served 15 years with the US Army, mostly overseas, Kandahar, Fallujah, places that left scars I carried home. After my discharge, I bought a modest 2-story house in the suburbs of Austin, Texas, a nice quiet neighborhood called Cedar Park, far enough from the heart of the city to give me peace of mind, but close enough to keep things convenient. From the outside, my place looked ordinary enough. Neatly trimmed lawn, a stone path winding toward the porch, a fresh coat of paint every 2 years. Nothing about it shouted prepper, but beneath the surface, I'd spent years turning it into my own personal bunker. I reinforced the basement walls with concrete and steel, installed solar panels discreetly along the roof, and stored enough water and food to comfortably ride out any disaster, natural or man-made. My arsenal was extensive, maybe more than some might call reasonable, but to me, firearms were tools, and every tool had its place and purpose. For nearly 2 decades, I'd tracked global crises meticulously. Swine flu, Ebola, SARS. I followed each one obsessively, convinced they weren't natural occurrences. I believed they were controlled tests, dry runs for something bigger. Stephanie tolerated my theories at first, but patience wore thin over the years. Eventually, she packed her bags and left, taking our son Ben. He was 21 now, living downtown, attending college at UT Austin. We spoke occasionally, always polite, always distant. But as always happens, the problems don't start loud and clear. Everything began subtly, so subtly that I initially dismissed the warning signs. It was early on a Thursday morning, just after dawn. A persistent barking erupted from my neighbor's backyard. The dog belonged to Linda and Gary next door, usually quiet people, their Labrador generally docile. But that morning, something agitated it relentlessly. I peered through my blinds, catching glimpses of it pacing and clawing at the fence, fixated on something beyond sight. I considered checking on it, but a distant siren distracted me. An ambulance, its wail high-pitched and urgent, raced along a distant street toward the city. Strangely, the siren never seemed to fade. It just echoed on, looping around in the morning air, unsettlingly constant. I turned on the local news, but they reported nothing unusual. Traffic congestion, weather, the usual trivialities. But the tension in my gut had already settled in. After my years in combat, I knew when to trust my instincts. Something felt wrong, like that eerie calm before a firefight. I stepped outside onto the porch, taking stock of the neighborhood. A few curtains fluttered as neighbors peered cautiously out their windows, equally puzzled by the dog's barking and the distant siren. The early morning sky was heavy, clouded, like nature itself was holding its breath. Hours slipped by in uncomfortable silence, broken only by intermittent helicopter passes overhead, first civilian, then military. Their shadows raced across lawns and rooftops, too low and too frequent for standard drills. Around noon, the news finally shifted. Reports of violent incidents in downtown Austin began trickling in. Authorities dismissed them as isolated events, urging calm, but something in the anchor's eyes betrayed uncertainty. By mid-afternoon, the sirens grew constant. Police cruisers sped past our quiet street, flashing lights scattering shadows across houses. A breaking news banner replaced regular programming. Downtown Austin was now under curfew. Citizens were instructed to remain indoors, avoid contact with strangers, and report unusual behavior immediately. I stepped into action. Years of rehearsed scenarios kicked in smoothly, comforting me with familiarity. I sealed and locked every door and window, double-checked my power reserves, confirmed water tanks were full. From my attic window, I watched the horizon, where the city skyline rose. Black smoke twisted upward, slow and dense, unnatural in its darkness. Then my phone buzzed urgently. Ben calling. His voice trembled with confusion, words tumbling over each other. He was trapped downtown in his dorm. Police barricades had blocked the main streets, and he wasn't sure he could leave. His questions were rapid fire. Should he run, hide, wait for help? I kept calm, instructing him to barricade the door, turn off the lights, and wait quietly. He promised he'd call again soon, ending the call abruptly when someone pounded on his door. My gut twisted sharply as the call disconnected. As darkness descended, reality hit harder. The sky glowed sporadically, flares illuminating downtown, punctuated by muted, distant explosions. Soon, the low drone of jet engines approached, military craft slicing through clouds toward the city center. I knew the sounds too well from overseas deployments. Then came the unmistakable whistle of ordnance dropping, punctuated by deep thuds shaking the earth beneath my feet. They were bombing parts of downtown Austin. My shortwave radio, tuned to emergency frequencies, crackled. The voice was crisp, professional, yet strained. "This is a public service announcement. Remain indoors at all costs. Lock and barricade all entry points. If a family member displays aggression or confusion, isolate yourself immediately. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." I felt strangely validated, yet utterly empty. Everything I'd warned about for years was unfolding precisely as feared, but it brought no comfort, no satisfaction. Outside, movement caught my eye beneath the dim streetlights. My neighbor Gary stood in his driveway, backlit eerily. His posture was unnatural, slouched, head tilted oddly. Linda appeared behind him, walking stiffly, arms hanging limply by her sides. As they turned toward my house, the dim illumination showed blood staining their clothing, faces distorted into vacant masks. Gary's eyes reflected the porch light blankly. They staggered, slow and uncertain, toward my front yard. I had prepared for looters, riots, even military invasion, but nothing quite like this. They weren't aggressive, just persistent, shuffling closer with grim determination. In the background, distant gunshots echoed, panicked cries breaking through between volleys. I didn't want confrontation, not yet. I retreated inside, securing the reinforced storm shutters, bolting the main door with a solid steel brace. Gary and Linda would find no easy entrance. Returning to the basement shelter, I flicked on the monitors connected to exterior cameras. The infrared image showed them now at my porch, scratching weakly at the barricades like insects probing for weaknesses. Further down the street, shadowy figures began appearing, wandering aimlessly, some pausing occasionally to inspect abandoned cars or open doors. I sat alone, the glow from screens bathing my shelter in cool blue tones, my fingertips drumming absently on the cold steel desk. Time felt distorted, reality a distant concept. My thoughts drifted constantly to Ben. Was he still safe? Could he hold out until rescue, if any came? Outside, the undead residents of Cedar Park increased slowly, multiplying like shadows stretching with the night. The first 24 hours had just begun, but already, my carefully crafted plans felt incomplete, insufficient. I stared at the monitor, watching my neighborhood transform into something unrecognizable, and knew I had only scratched the surface of whatever nightmare awaited. The stillness outside was deceptive. There was no screaming now, no more distant sirens. Just the slow, deliberate shuffle of figures where people used to jog, mow their lawns, wave from driveways. I sat there in silence, absorbing it all, the illusion of control I'd clung to beginning to unravel. The night dragged on endlessly, each minute stretching slowly into the next, blurring reality and anxiety into a monotonous haze. My basement shelter, secure as it was, felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. The monitors glowed softly, bathing the reinforced walls in a cold, ghostly hue. Outside, the number of shadowy figures had steadily grown, drifting aimlessly through yards and streets, clustering silently beneath streetlights. Their slow movements and blank expressions sent waves of unease crawling up my spine. These weren't riots or protests. This was something far more sinister, something I'd long feared, and yet, in this moment, struggled to fully comprehend. Around 3 in the morning, after several tense hours pacing back and forth, I picked up my phone and dialed Ben's number again. Each unanswered ring felt heavier than the last, but finally, just as despair tightened its grip, his voice cut through the static-laden connection. The relief was profound, brief, and then replaced immediately by urgency. Ben's voice, normally confident and calm, carried the weight of exhaustion and worry. He had managed to barricade his dormitory room, moving furniture and heavy appliances against the door, isolating himself from the chaos raging through campus. Through the windows, he described seeing overturned vehicles and clusters of people stumbling around erratically, driven by something primal and horrifying. Our conversation quickly shifted to action. Waiting passively was no longer an option, especially as his descriptions painted an increasingly desperate scene. We decided it was safest for Ben to make his way out of the city and towards Cedar Park. The streets downtown were clogged and chaotic, but he assured me he could avoid the main roads. As a kid, I'd taught him every back road and hidden shortcut between downtown and our suburb. It was strange, ironic even, that these old lessons from my paranoid obsession would now become critical lifelines. Still, the thought of him alone on those dark streets was agonizing. Stephanie remained unreachable. Her phone continued to ring through to voicemail, her social media updates frozen days earlier. She'd been planning a vacation with her new partner, someplace overseas with blue water and white sand. There was nothing I could do for her, and a selfish part of me was grateful she might be far away from the chaos here. But Ben was different. He was here, trapped in the heart of everything I'd tried to prepare us against. He was my priority now, and nothing else mattered until he was safe by my side. As dawn began to paint the sky a dim grayish purple, I double-checked my gear meticulously. I strapped on a bulletproof vest beneath a loose jacket, filled pockets with extra magazines, and secured a military-style flashlight onto my belt. After some hesitation, I took my .45 caliber pistol from its locked case. The weight felt both familiar and foreign. Despite all my preparation and weapons training, I had never fired a single shot outside the controlled environment of the firing range since returning home. The thought of pulling the trigger in my own city, on people who'd once been neighbors or friends, troubled me deeply. Instead, I slipped the pistol into its holster and took up a metal baseball bat, something solid, practical, and less permanent. I knew the gun was there if things went too far, but for now, I preferred not to cross that line. I moved cautiously upstairs, taking a careful look out the window at the street below. The shuffling figures had dispersed slightly, leaving a clear, if temporary, path. The early morning air carried a faint, acrid smell of distant fires, mingling with the chill. My truck, a dependable dark blue Ford, waited silently in the driveway. Its reinforced bumper and sturdy frame were reassuring reminders of the foresight I'd once been mocked for. Stepping outside, I immediately felt vulnerable, my senses heightened by the oppressive silence that surrounded me. The sky was bruised with smoke, a grim backdrop to the suburban homes I'd known for years, now lifeless and still. With careful, quiet steps, I approached my truck, scanning every shadow, every movement. Gary and Linda were gone, perhaps drawn to other targets. The driveway felt exposed, dangerously open. Starting the engine broke the silence sharply, the low rumble echoing down empty streets. I gripped the wheel, driving slowly, headlights off, avoiding sudden movements that might attract unwanted attention. As I reached the end of my street and turned onto Whitestone Boulevard, evidence of the outbreak's chaos became clearer. Cars stood abandoned at odd angles, their doors ajar, interiors eerily empty. A few figures wandered aimlessly, indifferent to my passage. Their slack faces turned toward the sound, then drifted away again. My grip tightened reflexively on the wheel, fighting every instinct to accelerate and flee. The roads closer to downtown grew increasingly difficult to navigate. Blocked intersections forced detours onto narrower side streets. Occasionally, I glimpsed survivors, hidden behind curtains or barricaded inside storefronts, watching warily as my truck passed. No one offered help, and I asked for none. Survival now was an individual battle, every person an island in the swelling sea of chaos. Finally, Ben called again, his voice crackling urgently through the phone. He'd managed to navigate several miles on foot, dodging the main roads and hiding from roving clusters of infected. We agreed to meet near a grocery store parking lot halfway between our two positions, an area he knew well. He sounded exhausted but resolute, determined to reach safety. I pushed my truck harder now, my caution battling against my desperation. When I reached the rendezvous point, a large parking lot outside an H-E-B grocery store on North Lamar Boulevard, the place felt hauntingly abandoned. Overturned shopping carts lay scattered, groceries spilling from torn bags onto asphalt stained with darker, unsettling marks. I parked the truck, cautiously stepping outside, gripping the bat tightly as I scanned the deserted scene. A single figure appeared at the far end of the parking lot, moving steadily toward me. My heart leapt with momentary relief as I recognized Ben's familiar gait and shape, silhouetted against the early morning gloom. I started toward him, breaking into a hurried jog, but a sudden movement from between two parked cars instantly shattered my relief. A figure lurched toward me, arms reaching out aggressively. The man was roughly my age, dressed in torn jeans and a stained t-shirt, eyes vacant but focused, hands clawing the air wildly. Instinct took over. Without hesitation, I swung the metal baseball bat hard, catching the attacker squarely and knocking him sideways. He stumbled back, staggered but undeterred, his movements slow but relentless. I swung again, harder this time, finally knocking him fully to the ground. He fell, twisted awkwardly, but continued to reach weakly, crawling toward me. I backed away swiftly, unnerved and breathless, unwilling yet to end him completely. Ben reached my side moments later, gripping my arm tightly, relief mingling with shock across his face. His eyes moved quickly, taking in my battered attacker still attempting feebly to regain his footing. We moved back to the truck hurriedly, securing ourselves inside without further incident. Ben's presence filled the cabin with renewed hope, tempered by the reality we both now faced. As I started the engine again, the distant sounds of military jets overhead filled the air, followed by deep, resonating explosions coming from the heart of downtown. I glanced toward the city skyline, now painted with plumes of dark smoke rising high against the dawn sky. The bombing had intensified, a desperate and brutal attempt to control something already beyond comprehension. Ben sat quietly, staring blankly ahead as we drove toward home, the harsh realities of our new world settling around us. The silence between us said everything words could not. Survival was just beginning, and every choice from here onward would carry heavier consequences than either of us had ever imagined. As the city shrank behind us, I tightened my grip on the wheel. The smoke curled higher in the rearview mirror, like a reminder that we were leaving something behind that wasn't coming back. I didn't say it out loud, but I knew Ben was thinking the same thing I was. Whatever line had been crossed in those first few hours, we weren't going back to the world we knew. The road home felt longer, twisted and distorted by what we'd just experienced. Ben sat in the passenger seat, quiet, eyes locked forward, processing the chaos of the city we'd just escaped. Buildings flashed past, their windows dark and empty. Abandoned vehicles lay strewn haphazardly across intersections, doors hanging ajar. The once lively, bustling suburban landscape now felt alien, frozen in a grim, silent stillness. I drove carefully, threading the truck slowly through the scattered wreckage, avoiding unnecessary attention. With each passing block, we both sensed that whatever was happening wasn't going to end quickly. It was too widespread, too thorough in its destruction. We were only about a mile from the house when the unexpected blare of music shattered the silence, startling both of us. A large, battered pickup truck barreled suddenly out of a side street, heavy metal blasting from speakers loud enough to shake windows. It swerved recklessly, tires screeching against pavement, headlights cutting violently through the gloom, narrowly missing us by inches. I wrenched the wheel sharply to the right, barely dodging the collision, and slammed on the brakes. The truck sped past without slowing, music and manic laughter fading rapidly as it disappeared down another side street. My hand stayed locked tight on the wheel for a moment longer, tension simmering beneath the surface. Ben stared silently after the retreating vehicle, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing fear. Neither of us said anything as I carefully resumed driving, our pace cautious, eyes scanning every intersection. The encounter left us both shaken, a stark reminder that infected individuals weren't our only threat. The panic gripping survivors was equally dangerous. After several more tense minutes of driving through the eerily quiet streets, our familiar neighborhood finally came into view, offering momentary relief. Pulling into our driveway, I quickly maneuvered the truck behind the house, hiding it from immediate view. It wasn't perfect, but it would at least prevent drawing unnecessary attention from anyone wandering by. We got out cautiously, scanning our surroundings. The air felt heavy, tainted by distant smoke and burning chemicals, drifting in from the city. I quickly motioned Ben inside, securing the reinforced doors and storm shutters behind us with reassuring metallic thuds. As the final lock clicked into place, a strange mixture of relief and confinement settled around us, reminding me sharply that our safety, for now, meant being isolated completely from whatever was left of the outside world. Once secure, I led Ben downstairs into the basement shelter I'd spent years meticulously preparing. He hadn't seen it in several years, not since he'd left home, so the sight of it seemed to momentarily stun him. Sturdy metal shelves lined the walls, filled neatly with canned foods, bottled water, medical supplies, and various emergency kits I had put together over years of careful planning. An array of communication equipment sat on a sturdy table against the far wall: shortwave radio, CB transceiver, spare batteries, solar chargers, all neatly arranged and carefully maintained. Nearby, secure weapons lockers stood locked but accessible, each clearly labeled. I explained their contents briefly: shotguns, handguns, rifles, ammunition neatly stacked and clearly marked. Ben looked at me, eyebrows raised slightly, perhaps seeing for the first time that my obsession hadn't simply been irrational paranoia. Perhaps it had always seemed over the top, even crazy. But now that the world had shifted beneath our feet, all my painstaking preparations no longer seemed so extreme. Ben's expression was thoughtful, uncertain, as he surveyed the room slowly, taking in the careful organization. For years, he'd seen my preparations as eccentricities that had driven his mother away and distanced him from me. Now, as he absorbed the reality around him, I sensed that maybe, just maybe, he understood at least some of my reasoning. Still, a tense quietness lingered between us, a reminder of years spent apart. After we settled briefly, Ben took out his phone, staring anxiously at the screen. I watched silently, noticing the worry etched on his face. Hesitantly, he finally admitted that his girlfriend Julia hadn't responded to any messages or calls since yesterday. She had fallen ill several days earlier, fever, headaches, and had requested privacy, time to rest and recover. Ben's voice was strained as he shared this, guilt and worry evident beneath the surface. He hesitated briefly, then looked at me, clearly uncertain how to proceed. I immediately knew the question that lingered unspoken. Should he try to find her? I considered carefully before responding, weighing the risks and practicality. After a long pause, I quietly explained that venturing back outside now would be too dangerous, especially without knowing what we'd find or whether Julia was even safe. Going back into the chaos wasn't an option I could support. Ben's expression darkened immediately, frustration evident in his tightening jaw, but I continued softly, explaining that our priority needed to be survival, remaining secure and safe until we understood the broader situation clearly. Ben argued briefly, reminding me with barely suppressed anger that Julia meant the world to him, and he couldn't simply abandon her. He looked me straight in the eye, and in that moment I clearly saw my younger self, determined, headstrong, fiercely loyal. Yet I had to be firm, gently, but clearly restating my position. There was no guarantee she was still alive, and going back outside without careful preparation was a risk we simply couldn't take. Ben's frustration grew visibly, yet after a tense moment he seemed to realize the futility of arguing further. The silence that followed felt thick, uncomfortable. Ben turned away, examining shelves of supplies absently, wrestling quietly with his emotions. I watched him from across the room, understanding his turmoil, yet knowing we couldn't afford impulsive decisions now. The reality was harsh but simple. Survival required discipline, caution, and sacrifice, even if the choices felt cruel and unbearable. I'd spent years preparing for precisely such brutal dilemmas, though living them was infinitely harder than imagining them had ever been. Eventually, Ben acknowledged my point, though reluctantly and quietly. He seemed suddenly very aware of his position. This wasn't his house. These weren't his preparations, and despite our strained history, he now relied entirely on my judgment. The realization clearly disturbed him, highlighting the uncomfortable power dynamic between father and son, one that had haunted our relationship ever since his childhood. Ben had always struggled with seeing me as overly controlling, unreasonable in my paranoia. Now, ironically, he had no choice but to accept my judgment, the very judgment he'd spent years distancing himself from. Despite the tension, there was also a quiet mutual acknowledgement in his eyes. Perhaps he understood now why I'd behaved as I had all those years. I wasn't sure if this understanding would bridge the gulf between us entirely, but it was a start. For now, we were together, safe in the small, sturdy fortress I'd constructed over years of solitary preparation. The outside world had unraveled rapidly, but inside, at least temporarily, we could focus on assessing and planning our next steps carefully. Above us, the distant sound of helicopters moved slowly overhead, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Moments later, we felt the subtle vibrations of distant explosions, a grim reminder of how quickly civilization had deteriorated. Neither of us spoke immediately, absorbing the gravity of our situation in the silence that followed. Our safety here was temporary. We both knew that. We had bought ourselves time, but the reality remained clear. The world we'd known was fading, replaced by something dark and uncertain, something we would have to face together, prepared or not. A couple of hours later, just as the afternoon was slipping into early evening, that same pickup truck roared back down our street, music blaring even louder now, heavy bass vibrating the glass panes of my reinforced windows. I watched silently from the upstairs window, Ben standing quietly at my shoulder, both of us concealed behind thick curtains. The truck screeched to a halt, skidding across the pavement before coming to rest diagonally in the middle of the street. Several figures jumped out, stumbling slightly, clearly impaired, maybe high or drunk. It didn't take long to realize their intentions. They carried bats, crowbars, and at least two of them held pistols loosely at their sides, their movements wild, unpredictable, laughing and shouting to each other in slurred voices as they spilled into the neighborhood like a sudden storm. From my position upstairs, I had a clear view of the scene unfolding. I motioned for Ben to stay quiet and motionless, my heart sinking as I recognized one of the houses they were targeting. The house belonged to Joe Mason, a retired mechanic who'd lived across from us for over a decade. Joe was stubborn, fiercely independent, and like me, always wary of the changing world around him. I knew he'd been preparing too, but his setup wasn't nearly as robust as mine. As the intruders stumbled up onto Joe's porch, hammering at the front door and windows with crowbars, I felt a tight coil of anxiety begin to twist inside me, anticipating what might happen next. Joe must have been waiting inside, watching these marauders through his blinds, perhaps quietly hoping they'd move on, choose another house, but knowing deep down he would have to face them eventually. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the street, signaling the breaking of glass as one of the group shattered Joe's front window. Their loud laughter and crude, taunting shouts rang clearly through the air, harsh and grating, completely oblivious to the danger they themselves were now attracting. As I watched through narrowed eyes, Joe made his stand. The unmistakable boom of a shotgun roared from within his home, startling the attackers outside. One of them collapsed instantly, falling heavily onto Joe's porch, unmoving. The others scattered for cover momentarily, stunned into sobriety by the sudden, lethal resistance. But Joe's bravery came at a high cost. The remaining attackers quickly recovered. One of them, a tall, lanky man with long, greasy hair, pulled out a handgun and returned fire blindly through the broken window, firing rapidly and recklessly, shouting obscenities as he emptied his weapon. Another loud blast erupted from Joe's shotgun, splintering the wood frame of his porch, narrowly missing the attackers. Joe's courage was strong, but his aim less so. It was a battle he was never equipped to win, not against younger, ruthless men who valued nothing but chaos and opportunism. Seconds later, The gunman managed to land a shot. Joe stumbled back, visible briefly through the shattered window, clutching his chest before crumpling heavily onto his living room floor, out of sight. From across the street, hidden behind my secure walls, I felt a wave of helpless anger. I had always liked Joe, respected his stubborn practicality, but intervening would mean risking Ben's safety and our carefully built defenses. I couldn't afford reckless heroics now. I glanced at Ben, whose expression was filled with shock, anger, and silent questions. I placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, silently urging caution, reinforcing the need to remain quiet, remain hidden. He nodded slowly, clearly struggling with the impulse to help, but acknowledging the painful necessity of restraint. The attackers outside seemed momentarily satisfied, cheering loudly as they kicked open Joe's door, rushing inside to loot whatever supplies he might have stored. Their crude voices echoed clearly, laughing about the food, liquor, and ammunition they'd found, oblivious to the consequences their loud intrusion was beginning to cause. Even as they celebrated their brutal victory, movement caught my eye from farther down the street. Slow, shambling forms were emerging gradually from the shadows, attracted by the commotion and noise. I recognized Gary and Linda among the figures, vacant expressions now even more unsettling as they were joined by several other neighbors I once knew, now reduced to wandering shadows of their former selves. Unaware of the danger closing in, the marauders continued their looting spree, recklessly throwing furniture and belongings into the street, making crude jokes about Joe's belongings, ignorant to how swiftly the tables were turning. Inside my fortified home, Ben and I watched tensely, knowing exactly how this was going to unfold. Ben's fists were clenched, his breathing carefully measured as he watched the scene with barely contained rage and grief. This was his first direct encounter with the raw cruelty of this new reality, the merciless nature of humanity stripped bare by disaster and desperation. I wanted to comfort him, but words felt empty and useless in the face of what we were witnessing. Soon enough, the attackers realized their mistake. As they emerged from Joe's house, burdened with their loot, they froze in stunned confusion at the sight of the slow, inexorable approach of the undead figures. Their laughter died instantly, replaced with urgent shouts and panicked movements. They fired recklessly at the advancing zombies, emptying magazines wildly, their initial bravado disintegrating rapidly into chaos and desperation. But bullets, fired hastily and inaccurately, were mostly wasted, failing to stop the inevitable. One of the intruders, panicked and disoriented, broke away and ran toward the truck, dropping his stolen goods onto the pavement as he fled. But his escape ended quickly. Several infected neighbors converged around him, their slow, methodical movements overpowering his wild struggles. His desperate screams echoed horribly through the street before abruptly silencing. His friends, still fighting desperately, abandoned their ill-gotten spoils, retreating in blind panic to their vehicle. Tires squealed, the engine roared to life, and moments later, they sped recklessly from the street, leaving behind their companion and the wreckage of their raid. In the aftermath, silence descended once more, punctuated only by distant moans and soft shuffling. The undead slowly dispersed again, resuming their aimless wandering, though their numbers now appeared greater. Joe's house sat open and empty, dark windows gaping like open wounds, debris scattered haphazardly around it, a painful reminder of the violence we'd just witnessed. Ben turned away from the window, clearly shaken, anger still simmering quietly beneath his tense posture. I gently guided him back downstairs into our secure basement, away from the scene above. He sat quietly, staring blankly at the floor, processing everything we'd just witnessed, struggling to understand how humanity could collapse so swiftly, so brutally. I knew what he was feeling. I'd seen it before in combat zones overseas, in places where order dissolved suddenly into chaos. I'd hoped never to see it again. Certainly not here, not in the quiet neighborhood I'd carefully chosen for peace and safety. Ben eventually looked up, finally breaking his silence to ask quietly about Joe, about what we could have done. My response was measured but honest, telling him softly that there was nothing we realistically could have done, not without jeopardizing our own lives and our long-term safety. The truth felt bitter and insufficient, but it was the reality we now faced. In this brutal new world, Every decision had heavy consequences. Every action carried immense risk. We sat together quietly, allowing the heavy silence to linger, understanding implicitly that this was only the beginning of many harsh choices we would inevitably face. The attack on Joe had been brutal, ugly, and it wouldn't be the last. Yet for now, hidden behind fortified walls and locked doors, we had bought ourselves a fragile, temporary safety, one we'd have to defend fiercely against threats both living and dead, knowing all too clearly how easily the line between civilization and chaos could blur into oblivion. Ben and I spent hours in tense silence, each lost in private thought, punctuated only by occasional distant gunshots or the low, drifting groans from the shadows beyond our secure walls. My basement shelter, so carefully prepared and stocked, felt oddly smaller now, its reinforced walls pressing closer around us with every passing minute. The screens of my surveillance system bathed us in a cold, bluish glow, illuminating Ben's weary, thoughtful face as he silently observed the empty street outside. The events at Joe's house had left both of us feeling hollow, forced brutally to confront our own limitations and the ruthless nature of this new reality. Eventually, I busied myself by checking and double-checking our supplies, an instinctive coping mechanism I'd developed over years of preparation. The routine felt comforting, familiar amidst the chaos. I silently inventoried canned food, bottled water, medical supplies, and ammunition, knowing full well we had enough to last weeks, perhaps even months if rationed carefully. Still, anxiety gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, reminding me constantly that our sanctuary, as secure as it was, remained isolated. Survival demanded eventual mobility, communication, and perhaps alliance with other survivors, none of which felt feasible given our current situation. Ben, meanwhile, continued trying intermittently to contact Julia, his girlfriend, quietly dialing her number and leaving messages when she didn't answer. Each unsuccessful attempt deepened the lines of worry on his face, frustration mingling visibly with helplessness. He paced briefly, then stopped, visibly torn between his desire to help her and the harsh, logical advice I'd offered earlier, that leaving our fortified position now was reckless, a risk too great to justify. The same thing happened when he tried to call his mother. I told him that I had already tried many times, but without any luck. I felt his resentment clearly, though it remained unspoken. The tension between us hung thick in the silence, compounded by years of strained communication and unresolved misunderstandings. I knew that repairing our fractured relationship wasn't going to be easy, especially now, under circumstances forcing us constantly into hard decisions. Outside, the streets grew quieter, punctuated only occasionally by the distant echoes of gunfire or the steady rumble of military aircraft passing overhead. Through my basement monitors, I scanned the surrounding area vigilantly. The infected were scattered now, drifting aimlessly, their slow, meandering movements both reassuring and disturbing. I knew from past experience that their limited cognition meant they posed little immediate threat so long as we remained concealed and quiet. Still, their presence, former neighbors transformed into walking reminders of our fragile humanity, was deeply unsettling. Each familiar face, twisted now into a vacant mask, served as a stark warning of the fate awaiting careless survivors. Around midnight, Ben quietly asked about our long-term plan, a topic I'd been avoiding carefully. He clearly understood that despite our robust preparations, permanent isolation wasn't sustainable indefinitely. His question was cautious, tentative, yet loaded heavily with expectation. I sighed, choosing my words carefully as I explained the uncertainty we faced. Our immediate goal was simply to survive these first critical days, allowing the initial chaos outside to subside. Beyond that, we'd need more information, communications from authorities, if any remained, or from other survivors. The shortwave radio offered potential avenues for this, but so far, we'd heard nothing useful. Ben nodded slowly, absorbing the uncertainty calmly, though I saw clearly that the lack of concrete answers troubled him deeply. Hours passed slowly, marked only by occasional shifts in position or the intermittent hum of the ventilation system filtering fresh air from hidden intakes placed discreetly around the property. Despite my exhaustion, sleep felt impossible, vigilance overriding fatigue. My thoughts drifted inevitably toward the bleak future stretching uncertainly before us. How many others remained safe and hidden, waiting desperately for rescue? How many more had fallen victim, overtaken by panic, violence, or infection? Each question deepened my unease, reinforcing the isolation pressing steadily inward. Around dawn, just as pale daylight began creeping slowly into the basement through the narrow reinforced window slits, Ben's attention snapped abruptly to one of the monitors. Movement had caught his eye. Figures emerging cautiously from a house several doors down, clearly survivors. I recognized them immediately. It was the Rodriguez family, neighbors we'd known casually for years. Maria and Carlos had 2 teenage daughters, polite and friendly, always waving cheerfully when passing by. Now they moved cautiously, Carlos holding a baseball bat protectively, while Maria and the girls carried backpacks stuffed hastily with supplies. Ben immediately looked at me, silently questioning our next move. Should we attempt contact, offer assistance, or maintain our secure isolation? It was a decision I'd anticipated yet dreaded. Survival logic urged caution, isolation, but the sight of neighbors we knew, people with whom we'd exchanged friendly conversations and occasional backyard barbecues, strained that logic painfully. After several tense moments, I decided quietly that the risk outweighed any potential benefit. Contacting them now would jeopardize our carefully established security measures, possibly attracting unwanted attention from infected or opportunistic raiders. Ben's expression darkened immediately with silent disagreement, yet he remained quiet, understanding my reasoning even if he didn't fully agree. We watched the Rodriguez family move cautiously down the street, their steps wary and tense. Carlos paused frequently, scanning carefully before proceeding, clearly nervous. Watching them filled me with deeper, painful regret and frustration. Years of preparation had taught me hard truths about survival, truths that now forced cruel decisions. Offering help to the Rodriguez family felt morally right, yet pragmatically impossible. Ben's rigid posture beside me clearly communicated his internal conflict, frustration and empathy battling fiercely within him. Neither of us spoke, unable or unwilling to verbalize the weight of what we'd just witnessed. After the family disappeared from view, Ben eventually stood quietly, pacing briefly before sitting heavily again, clearly wrestling with emotions he couldn't articulate. His silence spoke volumes, clearly conveying resentment toward my cold pragmatism, a frustration I understood but couldn't easily soothe. Survival decisions were rarely easy or pleasant, often forcing harsh choices that strained humanity to its breaking point. As daylight strengthened outside, the distant sounds of conflict and chaos intensified slightly. Aircraft flew overhead more frequently now, their powerful engines a grim reminder of military attempts at containment and control. My shortwave radio remained stubbornly silent, offering no useful updates or reassurances. I scanned through frequencies repeatedly, hoping desperately for official communications, evacuation notices, safe zones, any glimmer of organized response. Instead, I heard only static or scattered fragments of panicked transmissions from desperate survivors elsewhere in the city, their pleas for help heartbreaking reminders of the overwhelming scale of this catastrophe. I busied myself carefully checking weapons and ammunition, reassuring myself that our supplies remained secure and sufficient. I encouraged Ben to rest briefly, knowing exhaustion would impair judgment and reaction times. Reluctantly, he eventually agreed, resting briefly on the small cot I'd set up near the supply shelves. I watched him silently, understanding how difficult these past hours had been for him, recognizing how quickly his perspective had shifted, forced abruptly from carefree college student into a harsh new reality, demanding constant vigilance and heartbreaking choices. Several hours later, movement outside caught my attention once more. Several infected were now wandering the streets slowly. Their numbers increased noticeably. They seemed attracted by lingering noise from earlier events, drawn instinctively toward disturbances. Among them, I recognized faces from the Marauder attack, individuals who'd fallen victim either to violence or infection itself. The sight of them, transformed into mindless wandering shells, filled me again with profound unease. Each familiar face served as a stark warning, reminders that every mistake carried irreversible consequences. As evening approached, Ben stirred restlessly, finally waking with a start, clearly troubled by unsettling dreams. He glanced quickly at the monitors, tense as he surveyed the empty street and wandering figures outside. Neither of us spoke immediately, allowing silence to linger heavily between us. Eventually, Ben quietly expressed regret over our earlier decision regarding the Rodriguez family, though his voice lacked accusation. He understood logically why isolation mattered, yet emotionally struggled to accept the harshness inherent in our decisions. His struggle resonated deeply within me, reflecting my own internal conflicts. We ate quietly, simple canned meals warmed over a small camping stove, silence punctuated only by distant sounds of continuing conflict and chaos. I briefly explained our immediate goals: remain hidden, monitor outside carefully, and await signs of organized response. Ben listened silently, absorbing my pragmatic instructions carefully. Though I knew privately he still wrestled with emotional frustrations. Survival now meant accepting harsh truths, making difficult choices, enduring sacrifices neither of us fully anticipated. After finishing the meal, Ben volunteered to watch the monitors for a while, quietly mentioning that he needed something productive to occupy his thoughts. I didn't argue, recognizing that keeping busy was the best way to combat the heavy anxiety settling in around us. I used the opportunity to climb quietly up to the attic, then carefully onto the rooftop through a narrow hatch I had installed years earlier, precisely for observation purposes. It had seemed unnecessary at the time, but now it felt indispensable. The air above was thick with the acrid tang of smoke and chemicals, drifting from downtown Austin. From this elevated vantage point, the scope of the crisis became painfully clear. The distant city skyline was awash in flickering orange and red flames, massive plumes of smoke rising like dark pillars against a sky now stained with ash. The harsh glow of fires illuminated twisted silhouettes of buildings partially collapsed or burning, evidence of the ongoing military bombing campaign. Faint, muted explosions echoed occasionally, underscoring the grim reality unfolding only a few miles away. As my eyes adjusted to the dim twilight, I carefully scanned the neighborhood below, noting again the scattered vehicles, overturned trash cans, and broken windows, silent testimonies to chaos already past. I moved cautiously along the roof, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. From this position, I had a clear line of sight to the street and several surrounding houses. Movement caught my eye at one of the nearby homes, a small single-story property located diagonally across from mine. Peering closely, I recognized the Rodriguez family huddled in one of the interior rooms, visible only through a partially drawn curtain. They had apparently sought refuge there after their earlier attempt to leave had proven impossible. I watched as Carlos peered nervously out the window, a wary expression on his face as he scanned the darkening street. Maria held her two teenage daughters close, attempting to comfort them, clearly frightened yet determined. Their vulnerability was painfully evident, underscoring the harsh dilemma Ben and I had faced earlier when we'd opted not to help them. Guilt twisted uncomfortably within me once more, but I forced myself to remain calm, detached enough to observe objectively. Before I could retreat inside, movement at street level quickly shifted my attention. Several infected individuals, former neighbors now reduced to mindless, relentless shadows, began to shuffle slowly toward the Rodriguez house. Drawn perhaps by movement or the faint sounds of whispered voices, they converged steadily from different directions, slow yet inexorable. Carlos spotted them immediately, visibly panicked, hurriedly urging his family away from windows, trying desperately to barricade doors quietly. But their attempts at stealth were already compromised, the infected drawn instinctively toward the subtle sounds of their desperate activity. Watching helplessly from the rooftop, my stomach churned uncomfortably. We had made the pragmatic choice earlier to remain isolated, avoiding unnecessary risk, but the reality unfolding before me now felt unbearable. The Rodriguez family was vulnerable, trapped, facing imminent danger only yards from our secure position. My heart ached painfully at the thought of simply turning away again, letting them suffer the consequences alone. I thought of Ben's earlier anger, his frustration at our inaction, and knew immediately that this situation demanded a different choice. Survival required pragmatism, but survival without humanity was meaningless. I hurried back down through the attic, returning quickly to the basement shelter where Ben waited, watching monitors tensely. He looked up immediately, sensing my urgency. Without hesitation, I described the situation rapidly, explaining that the Rodriguez family was in imminent danger, facing an attack by several infected neighbors. Ben's eyes widened, anxiety mingling with determination in his expression. He didn't need convincing. His instinctive desire to help others was clear and unwavering. We both understood clearly the risks involved, yet now was not the time for caution. Now was the time for decisive action, for compassion amidst chaos. Quickly we moved to the weapons locker, unlocking it carefully and taking out the weapons we felt most comfortable using. I chose a reliable tactical shotgun, loading shells methodically, securing extra ammunition into my pockets. Ben selected a sturdy handgun, the grip familiar from our trips to the shooting range years earlier. His hands trembled slightly, betraying his tension, yet his gaze remained steady and resolute. Neither of us spoke unnecessarily, understanding implicitly the gravity of what we were about to do. In addition to firearms, we grabbed baseball bats, knowing that loud gunfire would inevitably attract unwanted attention. Measured caution and stealth would be essential if we hoped to rescue the Rodriguez family and return safely. Moving quietly upstairs, I quickly disengaged the main locks and barricades on the front door, easing it open cautiously. The street outside was dimly lit. Shadows stretched long and ominous in the pale moonlight. Infected figures had already begun to cluster around the Rodriguez house, clawing quietly at doors and windows, their slow movements menacing in their relentless determination. Ben and I exchanged one final glance, silently confirming our mutual resolve before stepping cautiously outside. The night air felt cold and heavy, filled with tension and the distant, acrid odor of burning structures. We moved carefully along the shadowed edge of the street, keeping our movements smooth and deliberate, watching the infected closely as we approached. Our breathing remained carefully measured, senses heightened by adrenaline and anticipation. As we closed in on the Rodriguez home, it became clear that immediate action was necessary. Carlos had barricaded their front door hastily with furniture, but the infected were beginning to break through, pushing persistently, the wooden door groaning under their combined weight. Carlos shouted desperately from inside, his voice carrying clearly, though muffled by panic and fear. Maria screamed briefly, a sound filled with raw terror and helplessness. Ben glanced at me briefly, silently signaling readiness. Without further hesitation, we sprang into action. I moved forward quickly, using the bat to strike decisively at the closest infected figure, aiming carefully for the head and neck. The blow was effective, the infected collapsing silently to the pavement. Ben followed my example, striking hard and fast, his breathing sharp but controlled. Together, we methodically engaged the small group of infected clustered around the door, using precise, focused strikes to quickly disable them. The infected offered limited resistance, their movements slow and predictable. Still, each confrontation required disciplined caution, precise timing to ensure our safety. Within moments, the immediate threat had been neutralized. The infected scattered motionless around us. I moved quickly to the Rodriguez front door, knocking urgently and calling out softly, reassuring them of our intentions. After a brief, tense pause, Carlos cautiously moved the barricade aside, opening the door carefully. His relief was immediate and palpable upon seeing us. Maria with girls emerged behind him, visibly shaken but unharmed. I quickly explained our plan, to escort them swiftly to the safety of our fortified home nearby. They nodded nervously but gratefully, eager for safety and protection. We moved swiftly back along the street toward our home, the Rodriguez family staying close, following our lead carefully. As we neared our property, movement in the shadows alerted me to additional infected approaching from farther down the street, drawn by earlier noise. I motioned urgently for the group to hurry, pushing them gently but insistently toward our door, now visible clearly ahead. Ben moved beside me, watching carefully, weapon raised defensively as we retreated step by cautious step. Reaching our home quickly, we guided the Rodriguez family inside, securing the reinforced door swiftly behind us. Immediately, I engaged the locking mechanisms, relief washing through me as the heavy metallic clicks confirmed our safety. The Rodriguez family stood silently nearby, still clearly shocked by their narrow escape, yet deeply grateful. Maria thanked us softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Carlos clasped my shoulder firmly, a gesture communicating clearly his deep gratitude and respect. Together we descended quietly back into our basement shelter, a newfound sense of community and shared survival offering small comfort amidst the broader chaos and devastation still unfolding outside. Our actions tonight had been risky, perhaps even reckless, yet they represented something essential: humanity's enduring capacity for compassion, even amidst brutal and unforgiving circumstances. Survival meant more than merely remaining alive. Survival required retaining our humanity, even when logic argued otherwise. As we settled quietly back into our shelter, exhaustion settled heavily around us, yet our resolve had strengthened. We would face whatever came next together, stronger and more resilient because of the choices we'd made tonight. Hours passed in subdued silence within our basement shelter. The Rodriguez family settled quietly into one corner of the room, comforting one another, their whispered reassurances blending softly into the muted hum of ventilation fans. Carlos sat near me, keeping a watchful eye on Maria and their daughters, Sofia and Elena, whose faces remained pale and anxious. Ben remained close as well, alert yet clearly exhausted from the stress of our recent rescue. The weight of responsibility hung heavily in the air, each of us silently absorbing the reality that our lives had irreversibly changed. Whatever future awaited beyond these reinforced walls would require strength, patience, and a stubborn determination to hold on to what little remained of our humanity. After checking once more that all locks, barricades, and security measures remained secure, I moved to the shortwave radio, its green display glowing reassuringly against the dim basement lighting. Throughout the night, I'd periodically adjusted frequencies, desperately hoping to find clear communications or organized responses from military or civilian authorities. Until now, the radio had yielded only static or fragmented snippets of panicked calls for help, a grim reminder of our isolation amidst the chaos. Still, I persisted stubbornly, scanning slowly through each frequency band again, determined not to lose hope entirely. As dawn approached, with pale grey light filtering faintly through reinforced window slits high above, a sudden burst of static cleared abruptly, replaced briefly by a calm, steady voice broadcasting clearly through the speaker. The transmission was faint, yet unmistakably professional, organized, a military or government broadcast. "Attention survivors in the greater Austin area," the voice said steadily, carrying the weight of official authority. "This is an emergency advisory. The region is currently experiencing an uncontrolled biological outbreak, resulting in widespread infection and civil unrest. Federal and state authorities are actively mobilizing to establish secure safe zones. If you can safely evacuate, proceed to one of the following rally points: Camp Mabry in central Austin, Austin Bergstrom International Airport, or Kelly Field Annex in San Antonio. Please use extreme caution when traveling. If you cannot safely reach these locations, remain indoors, maintain strict noise discipline, and await further instructions. This message will repeat every hour until further notice." As the broadcast faded again into static, a momentary sense of hope filled the room. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, we had confirmation that organized effort still existed, that somewhere beyond the chaos and ruin, groups of survivors were being sheltered, protected. Yet even as relief briefly lifted the heavy tension surrounding us, the harsh practical realities quickly set in. Traveling through infected streets toward evacuation points posed severe risks, particularly with our group of mixed ages and limited combat experience. We couldn't rush decisions, not now, not when so much depended on careful thought and cautious action. I glanced around quietly, meeting each person's eyes briefly. Carlos's face was tense. Maria held her daughters closer, clearly unsure of how best to proceed. Ben watched silently, visibly wrestling internally with the conflicting impulses of caution and hope. For years I'd prepared for precisely this kind of scenario, yet the true reality of survival was far more complex and emotionally fraught than my meticulous preparations had anticipated. Surviving the initial chaos was one thing, but navigating this uncertain future required far more nuanced, difficult choices. Ultimately, after a quiet but serious discussion, we decided collectively to remain sheltered for at least a few more days. This choice offered critical time to gather information, observe outside conditions carefully, and allow the worst of the immediate crisis to subside before attempting travel to any evacuation point. Carlos readily agreed with this cautious approach, clearly prioritizing his family's immediate safety. Ben was slightly restless, eager for action, and perhaps hopeful about reaching the evacuation points quickly, yet he understood the wisdom of patience, especially given recent events. In the meantime, we organized practical tasks to maintain morale and readiness. Carlos and Maria helped inventory supplies, counting canned goods, water bottles, medical items, and ammunition carefully, reassuring everyone that we had adequate provisions to last an extended period. Sofia and Elena busied themselves organizing sleeping arrangements and creating comfortable spaces within our limited shelter. Ben volunteered to help me closely monitor external cameras, observing infected activity carefully for patterns or indications of increasing risk. The hours slowly blended into days, marked by careful observation and quiet, steady routines. Occasionally, faint broadcasts broke through on our shortwave radio, updates from official channels gradually increasing clarity and detail, describing efforts underway to secure critical infrastructure, contain the infection, and consolidate safe zones. Some reports brought grim news: cities lost entirely, widespread chaos in larger metropolitan areas. But they also emphasized that organized resistance persisted stubbornly. Each broadcast reinforced our cautious optimism, a tentative belief that somewhere beyond the chaos, recovery was possible, and humanity was stubbornly fighting back. As days passed, the number of infected wandering our street gradually decreased, their slow, aimless movements shifting toward areas of greater noise and activity deeper in the city. Our carefully maintained silence and vigilance had effectively minimized risk, allowing us to observe cautiously without attracting unwanted attention. Yet each day spent isolated also deepened our sense of loneliness, highlighting the stark reality that survival required careful balance. Too cautious, and we risked permanent isolation. Too reckless, and we risked everything. On the morning of the 6th day, Ben approached me quietly, clearly eager to discuss our long-term plans. He spoke calmly, suggesting gently that perhaps soon would be the right time to attempt reaching an evacuation point, leveraging our carefully gathered intelligence and cautious preparation to minimize risk. Carlos and Maria joined the conversation, expressing cautious agreement. We had all carefully observed outside conditions, recognizing clearly that risks remained, but also that the immediate chaos had subsided slightly, offering a possible window of opportunity for cautious travel. Ultimately, after careful consideration, we agreed collectively to begin preparations for eventual travel, setting tentative plans to move cautiously toward Camp Mabry within the next few days, contingent upon careful ongoing observation of external conditions. Our preparations were thorough, organizing lightweight packs filled carefully with essential supplies: food, water, ammunition, medical kits, batteries, and communication equipment. Carlos and Ben carefully reviewed maps of local roads, identifying potential obstacles, alternative routes, and shelter locations. Maria and her daughters carefully repacked critical supplies, securing everything for swift travel. As the day approached to leave, emotions within the shelter grew increasingly complex. Each of us silently recognized that despite careful preparation, the journey ahead would be uncertain, risky, fraught with potential danger. Yet lingering indefinitely in isolated safety also posed significant risks: the slow erosion of resources, morale, and mental resilience. Survival meant embracing careful risks, facing the unknown with stubborn determination, resilience, and compassion. The morning of our planned departure dawned clear and quiet, a welcome reprieve from recent days filled with distant explosions, gunfire, and aircraft overhead. We gathered silently near the front door, backpacks secured tightly, weapons carefully checked and loaded, hearts heavy with both hope and trepidation. Before opening the reinforced door, I briefly reminded everyone of our core strategies: move swiftly and silently, avoid unnecessary confrontation, maintain constant awareness. Each nodded solemnly, understanding clearly the gravity of our journey ahead. I opened the door cautiously, stepping outside first, scanning carefully in all directions. The street was eerily quiet, clear of immediate threats. With quiet urgency, we moved swiftly together, navigating quickly toward our chosen evacuation route, moving cautiously yet decisively toward whatever future awaited us. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.